everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think we're going to have a few more people join us as we get into things. So we're so excited to see everyone here. Today, we are excited to share our fourth Bloomsbury Handbook Speaker Series session featuring Dr. Sanaz Adibian to discuss their chapter titled Ascertaining the Calm in the Crisis in Volume 2, the Bloomsbury Handbook on Context and Transformative Leadership in Higher Education. And her chapter explores an innovative perspective on the concept of crisis and creation rhythm. And I'm so excited to hear more about it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over and we'll get started.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Jenny. Before I start, I wanted to give a shout out to Mary. I see Mary in the room. Thank you so much for all the support that you provided in this journey. So yes, I'm going to try to share my screen. My name is Sanaz Adibian. I'm one of the professors here at Yorkville, and I am delighted and honored to be here. So ascertaining calm in a crisis. So when the idea of teaching leadership during a crisis, when that came about, the first idea that came to me is, what is crisis and what is the global effect of it? Interesting, and we'll get into words and linguistics by the time this is over. We'll probably be very tired of linguistics. But the word ascertaining, interestingly, it means to decipher, to distinguish, to decide calm in a crisis. And we'll kind of go into the relevancy of that. So I started looking at what role does crisis play in the dominion of our human experience. And we hear about globalization being more of a recent phenomenon, but as most people know, it started thousands and thousands of years ago with the main reasons that they explain are water, hunting, gathering, agriculture, religion, and among other things. But people started deciding to move from the locations that they were. There was an interesting pattern that developed when people were looking at these movements, this dynamic. And what developed was called order and crisis theory, or the crisis, or the chaos, not crisis, the order and chaos theory, or just the chaos theory. So initially, the idea was developed in mathematics. And the way that the math of it is, there is an original thought, original formula, and then there's an interruption. So the layout, the end result is not what is expected. And that's considered, there's an order to something, and then there's an interruption called chaos, and then order again. And going back to the globalization is when you're settled and everything's good, but then there's no water. Crisis. Then you expand, go to a different place, and then settle in. Okay, this is order. I'm used to this. But then interruption. So the force that changes the expected result is basically, in math, the phenomenon called the order and crisis notion. But then after mathematics, it got developed in other fields. So when I looked at the overall experience, so you can find it in biology, you can find it in all the other fields. So I started noticing a pattern with all of this, and we created for this this paper what's called creational rhythm. So as like we said, a system loses its equilibrium because it's this balanced safety. It becomes convoluted, and a system balances itself again. So if you look at the movement, there is inhalation, exhalation, and then there's steadiness. There is evolution, involution, and volution. There is life. Technically, life is the chaos, and death is the balance, right? Equilibrium. So life, and then there's in between, and then there's that equilibrium of death. So we notice that in existence, there is a pattern that's just distinguished, and it needs that whole crisis, out of ordinary, on discomfort. So like when we talk about inhale, the word inspiration, the etymology of that word means to breathe. So to inspire, if you look at people when they're inspired, they take there's a breath. And the opposite of that would be expire, right? And then there's in between. So this pattern, it came about kind of putting all the different formulas together. And how is that related? So looking at the whole idea of crisis, we looked at crisis in that sense because it's needed in the expansion of existence. It's part of the mathematics, the physics, the quantum physics of existence. So we looked at it linguistically, psychologically, and then leadingly, strategically, and globally. So what is crisis in certain times? And initially, when the idea came about, in order to find out how to lead people during uncertain times, I became curious to see what people consider certain times. What is this certainty that's in the mind? And we'll look into that. Why I'm looking at the process from a linguistic perspective was because when you look at something semantically, it means the meaning of a word, the system of a word gets expanded and changed based on the condition and the use throughout the ages. And the etymology of semantic means a sign, not sing, a sign and a symbol, right? So but etymology, the word etymology means the root of the word or the truth of it. So why was that sound vibration put together? And a word, basically, if you look at how a word is created, is the tongue moving up and down, the sine and cosine, and it gets dedicated to a condition that originally comes to be. So when you look at things from its root, it makes conceptualizing it a little bit easier. And I'll show you in a little bit how that works. So we went with etymological roots. Let's see if I can there we go. Okay. So interestingly, the word certain means to judge. So to be certain in a situation, etymologically, not that meaning, but the etymologic root, it means to decipher something. This is certain, right? So judging. And what's further interesting is the word crisis. It doesn't have the same root. It just has the same etymological meaning. Also means judging. So crisis and certainty both means to judge. And if you look at the statements people make, it's like, I want to make certain that this is going to go this way, right? So it's a deciphering in my mind. So it's in the eye of the beholder. What is a crisis? What is not? Psychology. Now, psychologically, and we'll put it together in a minute, there's a couple of words to look at. One is habit. Now, we've heard, especially in the psychological world, how effective habits are. Good habits versus bad habits. Good habits are considered something that is going to be beneficial. Bad habits, something that's going to be detrimental. But the word habit itself means appearance of being somewhere. It's essentially lack of awareness. Research shows that the physiology of our brain actually decides what we're going to do up to 10 seconds before we realize it. So that's like forever, right? So habits, yes, there are better habits than some other ones, but in a habit, the person is not present, their consciousness is missing. So, and then another word is the word control. And we'll put it together. Control means to just turn. It's in that word, to roll, to spin, right? And finally, it's the word perceived normal. When you're looking at normal in the data literature, it's always just described as perceived normal. The word etymological root of normal is to note something or to notice. And then in the 1800s, it became normal, was the carpenter square. So whenever a carpenter is doing something, like a cookie cutter, right? That is the definition of normal. And how's that together? So what is certainty? Essentially, based on these meanings and definitions, certainty, it's when I get to repeat my habits. That's it. Uncertainty is a disruption to my habitual patterns. So let's look at something that's really simple, like I take this drive to work, or here, using Wi-Fi internet, right? Everything works fine, and now the Wi-Fi is not working, and I have this meeting, right? Because my habits are interrupted, it's outside of my comfort zone. Now I'm in uncertainty, and that's considered crisis. Because remember, the word crisis itself also linguistically just means deciding that I am in a crisis. It's a judgment call. So by that, control is to take the action and put them in a certain way, so I can get the results I want. And if it's not happening, oh, it's frustrating. So during certain times and uncertain times, this dynamic essentially means that I have a goal. There's a start and a finish in my mind, whether I'm going from work or project or I'm living day to day. Most people are not present because we're living the habitual life. Yes, habitual further gets into addiction. And the word addiction, during the Roman times when somebody did something that was illegal or not, was unlawful, they would be stripped of all their title and they would become a servant. And that servant was called an addict. Right? So it's not just drugs and alcohol. We're used to our day repeating, especially if we're 10 seconds before we even realize it. Life is deciding what I'm going to do. So is my life predetermined or free-willed? Most of the things I'm doing, because I did it yesterday, and I did it the day before, and sometimes my mother did it a decade ago, right? So in that sense, crisis happens when a problem arises. In that journey, the word problem is also in that same dynamic. That means to give something an extension. Now I'm talking about etymologically, right? Etymologically, it goes to the Indo-European languages, and it means to give something an extension. So problem as well is in the eye of the beholder. It's not a neutral thing. I decide this is a problem. I decide this is not. So when I see these problems, then I'm in a crisis because I have judged that I can't handle, or there's a belief inside. So what is leadership then? See, these things are supposed to be removed. There you go. So I'll just pretend that wasn't there. So leadership during crisis. What does that look like? What does that mean? Because remember, crisis is in the eyes of the beholder, right? So leading, the word etymologically goes to the Indo-European movement, and to lead is to cause movement. Yeah, that's it. It's just to cause movement, a direction, just a shift. And when they say ship, it's like a group, a being, right? To put together. So leadership means a dynamic of movement. and we'll put it together in a second, but there's always, the movement can be external or internal. And then a few other words, the etymology of individual. It just means to be indivisible, not dividable. And I always find that humorous when they look at certain countries and they say, oh, we're individualistic society, yet they're so divisible. It's like, oh, are we though? Are we though? Right? So to be an individual means to remember the whole. Interesting, in one of the discussions last week came up, the word was save, to be saved came up, and that's not in the paper, but save means to be whole. That's all that means. To get rid of that device, to be whole, a feeling of wholeness. So there's the individual leading internal, again, external locus of control, and force versus power. Interestingly, in physics, whenever an entity, a dynamic, moves, leads internally, it is called power. Like that thing has this much power. And when it's pushed by an external thing, it's called force. So when a leader's coming outside, it's forced to do something. But when it's internal, it has its own power because it has that recognition. So global leadership starts with an individual. And we'll look at that in a second. The word courage is used. How to teach this, and we'll look at that a little bit, is the word courage means to have core, comes from core, heart connection, right? And once a person understands the leadership within, then the dynamic starts flowing. Let's look at the COVID-19 example. Right, so we looked at Google Trend, and the start of this is 2019 and then 2023, I believe, for both. The first one was uncertain. 2020, you see how much, I mean, everywhere when you turned on the TV was during this uncertain times. Even meditation classes. In this uncertain times, during this crisis, like it originated and brought that, the idea of uncertain times to the forefront. And then the word scared. If you look at how many times and where it was, like there's Alberta, like it was the highest for that search. And then the word scared was continually searched, constantly. Right? These were the languages that were constantly portrayed. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just this was the effect and the words that caused people the crisis feeling, right? So what is the difference between motivating through fear, motivation based on courage? So motivation, again, just means to move. I am motivated. That means I move, essentially lead, based on fear. Now, fear, etymologically, it says to go forward, but it's based on a belief of lack. Because I'm scared, I'm moving. And it breeds followship. Like follow me because I know better. It breeds that idea of, well, you don't know, so obviously I would know, right? Because the energy is based on I lack something, I can't do it, the doubt. And what's interesting that the idea of stress is not a automatic condition. Stress happens when there's a pressure. So any focus of energy in physics is called pressure, right? There's a pressure that happens. There's a converter here. I am the converter of this, for example, starting practicum or job or COVID, right? There's a pressure. Here, if I have self-doubt, that energy converts into, okay, I'm stressed because I can't do it, or I have these beliefs of lack. So it turns into some sort of a lack. But if I have the same pressure, but I am heart connected, we call that, oh, she's so passionate about it. It's the same thing, but it's courage based. The same passion that happens, and there's that stillness. We call that serenity and sometimes enlightenment, depending on the dynamic you're looking at. So motivation based on courage, it's heart-based, based on core. So who is a leader? What's interesting is, somebody asked, then if everybody finds that leadership, that movement, that courage inside, then who's going to lead? But what happens is when somebody understands and lets go of the fear and understands that crisis is in my mind and develops that leadership within themselves, then they're not going to fight with the person that knows better. Like, Jenny knows computer better than me, sure, right? So when her and I are sitting in a room, I don't need to prove myself, right? I just listen to her. But when there's doubt, then there's fighting. When there's doubt in myself, then I have to show, no, I know what I'm doing. You don't know. So a true leader, it happens when everyone recognizes their leadership here. And this is for the current time, the weather, the system today, because in the past decades, it was always, I am the ruler. You are the ruled, which worked. And that may be debatable, right? But, it had its system. But in today, if someone recognizes they don't lack anything, and if we put that in the education that, okay, we don't suffer who we are, we only suffer who we think we are, and release those dynamics, then when there's few people in the room, well, I know I don't know physics as well as this person who's the professor of physics. So I'm going to just listen. It becomes a lot more harmonious for those who are interested. Etymology of war is confusion. Interesting. The whole idea of when it's confused, a person seems they're in this mixture of different thoughts that's in that state of confusion, right? So calm at the helm. So the idea of calm, that goes back to the Greek eras. Usually when they would work during the hottest time of the day, they would rest, right? So the word calm means heated, because that's based on that origin. But then later on, it became based on tranquility and that peace, right? So if I understand that whatever's happening, it's a perceived crisis, right? And people are forced out of their comfort zone, then I can understand that, well, what is comfort? Comfort doesn't mean good. Comfort just means I have neurological wiring that's connected. People totally could be comfortable punching every third person they see. No problem, right? It's so comfortable. Comfort doesn't mean any sort of balance. It just means my neurons are used to this, right? So when they're out of this comfort zone, yes, they're losing that control, but it's in my mind, right? It's neural connection that to start looking at these dynamics in the education system. Okay, what is this comfort? Why am I comfortable? Kicking everybody. I don't know why people kick everybody, but there might be somebody who's comfortable doing that, right? There's people, comfort just means I'm used to it. I have been cultivated that way or cultured that way. So in the education system, in order to start looking at, okay, how do I educate with this? First, you can look at, there's so many people in our history that have had people living in harmony for eons, right? We can look at what were the dynamic, the First Nations, the ancient Persians or Egyptians, they had these dynamics. We can start looking. There was a time that I would not read anything other than those that were published by, A, B, and C. Then I realized how much I'm missing, how much I'm missing out of, right? Just by reading that. So expanding that idea to look at these different topics, not just what has been the pattern teaching today. Then the person has to go through that self journey of finding that leader within themselves, that movement within themselves, that tranquility and peace within themselves. I cannot, it's like a famous statement. I can't teach someone how to swim if I don't know how to swim. Right? And then if we build a society based on everybody learning how to practice and be that leadership, then the flow would be easier. And when to start? Now. As we know, during a time that's, there's a tornado, there's no time to build a shed. But if we look at these ideas, these negative self-beliefs that people have, like, I know it's very much a Western thought that we all make mistakes. Nobody is perfect. Oh, I'm just human. Nobody's perfect. And that's so depressing to me. Every time I hear that, it's so sad, right? And then I actually looked at the etymology of the word perfect, right? It just means form. It doesn't mean a specific form. It just means form. And then I found the capacity of human. It's actually infinite. The limitations are what I perceive for myself. Remember, I decide the problem. So essentially that would mean that this is what perfect looks like. And if I see it that way, then I can expand more. If there's characters I don't like, I can release. So when do I start that? Now, when I'm calm, not in the middle of a thunderstorm. Okay. Any questions?